What if almost everything you believed about Mexican people was only half the truth? Not a political half-truth, not a cultural misunderstanding, but a biological one, hidden for centuries inside the blood of over 130 million people. Scientists have spent decades trying to read this hidden code, and what they eventually found did not match the simple story that schools, textbooks, and popular culture had been repeating for generations. It broke that story apart completely. For more than 100 years, researchers, historians, and anthropologists have quietly asked one question that almost nobody wanted to answer directly. Who are Mexican people, really? At the deepest biological level. Not by nationality, not by language, not by the passport they carry, but inside their cells. Inside the strands of DNA passed down from parent to child for thousands of years. It sounds like a simple question. It is not. And when science finally gave an answer, it was nothing like what most people expected. For a long time, the story taught about Mexico was neat and tidy. Spanish explorers crossed the ocean, arrived on the shores of a new land, encountered great indigenous civilizations, and over centuries of mixing produced the modern Mexican people. The mestizo, a blend of native and European blood. Half and half. Clean. Easy to explain in one paragraph of a history book. Add a small mention of African ancestry, and the whole story was wrapped up in 3 neat ingredients mixing together into one identity. Simple to teach, simple to remember, simple to accept without asking more questions. But that tidy story left something out. And in science, when a story feels complete without actually being complete, that is exactly when people stop looking for what is missing. When modern genetic tools were finally turned toward the Mexican population, researchers examined something called mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed down only from mother to child, generation after generation, unchanged in its core lineage markers. And what showed up inside thousands of samples collected from across the whole country was staggering. Nearly 90% of maternal ancestry traced back to indigenous American lineages. Not 60%, not 70%, close to 90%. Through the mothers, through the long, unbroken chain of grandmothers and great-grandmothers stretching back thousands of years, the Mexican population was not a balanced 50-50 mixture at all. It was overwhelmingly, deeply indigenous. The European presence in this maternal line was small, almost a footnote, nothing like the dominant force the old textbook story implied. That single discovery alone should have been enough to force a rewrite of how Mexican ancestry gets explained. But it was only the beginning, because genetics never tells just one story. It tells several stories at the same time, and sometimes those stories completely contradict each other. The maternal line shows the history of mothers. But there is another line, passed only from father to son, carried on the Y chromosome, and in Mexico, this line tells an almost opposite story. When scientists studied the Y chromosome across mixed heritage Mexican populations, they found ancestry that was mostly European, somewhere around 65%, with native ancestry making up roughly 30%, and a smaller African component as well. Think about what that really means. Through the mothers, the ancestry is almost entirely indigenous. Through the fathers, the ancestry is mostly European. 2 completely different histories, sitting inside the same population, inside the very same bodies, but written into 2 separate parts of the genome. This is not a gentle blend of cultures meeting in the middle. This is the genetic signature of an imbalance, a lopsided meeting between 2 very different groups of people, and that imbalance left a permanent mark that has been passed down for more than 500 years. Scientists have a name for what caused this pattern, and they don't use the word lightly. It comes from studying exactly how this mixing happened on a demographic level. The historical record, combined with the genetic data, shows that European men fathered enormous numbers of children with indigenous women during the colonial period, far more than the reverse. That single demographic pattern is the reason the paternal and maternal lines split so sharply. European men passed down their Y chromosomes, indigenous women passed down their mitochondrial DNA, and the population that resulted carries both of these histories at once, the ancestry of the colonizers on one strand and the ancestry of the colonized on another. To really understand where this all started, we can't just look at events from 500 years ago. We need to travel back tens of thousands of years, long before Mexico existed, long before the Americas had a single human being living on them. We need to go back to Siberia. Genetic studies show that indigenous Mexican populations share deep ancestral connections with groups from northeastern Asia, tracing all the way back to the very first humans who ever set foot on American land. The distant ancestors of the people who would eventually build the great civilizations of Mesoamerica, the Maya, the Aztec, the Zapotec, the Mixtec, all trace their roots to Asia. They crossed into the Americas over a land bridge that once connected Siberia to Alaska, a stretch of frozen ground exposed when sea levels dropped during the last ice age. They weren't trying to discover a new continent. They were simply following herds of animals, trying to survive, moving forward one generation at a time. And that slow migration would eventually give rise to every civilization that would ever rise and fall across 2 entire continents over the next 15,000 years. Studies of Y chromosome data from native Mexican groups confirm the southward journey through the land bridge, linking native Mexican populations directly to ancient groups from south-central Siberia and parts of Canada. The genetic fingerprints match. The same lineage markers found in Mexican indigenous DNA appear in ancient Northeast Asian populations. This isn't a guess or a theory. It is written directly into the chromosomes of millions of people living right now, whether in small mountain villages or in the middle of Mexico City. And then, long before the Aztecs, long before the Maya built their pyramids, something extraordinary happened on the Gulf Coast of Mexico. This is where the Olmec civilization rose, considered by many archaeologists to be the very first great civilization of Mesoamerica. They built the massive carved stone heads that still stand today as one of the most mysterious monuments in the ancient world. And then, by around 400 years before our era, they disappeared. Not slowly faded, gone. Here is the detail that has puzzled scientists for decades. Researchers have not been able to find a clear, matching Y chromosome or mitochondrial DNA signature that can be directly traced back to the Olmec with certainty. The civilization that essentially laid the intellectual and cultural groundwork for everything that followed. For the Maya, for the later cultures of central Mexico, left behind monuments of stone but no fully traceable genetic thread. It means that at the very root of Mexican civilization sits an unsolved mystery. Scientists can point to exactly where these people lived and show you the incredible art they created, but they cannot say with full confidence today where their bloodline ultimately went. This is far more than a historical curiosity. It matters right now in hospitals and clinics because the genetic complexity of the Mexican population has direct consequences for medicine and health. One of the largest genetic studies ever done outside of Europe, a massive project based in Mexico City that sequenced the genomes of close to 150,000 adults, revealed something concerning. The portions of the genome linked to indigenous ancestry showed lower genetic variation overall, but a higher number of cases where both copies of a gene carried a loss of function change, meaning the gene essentially stops working properly. In plain terms, thousands of years of relative geographic isolation shaped certain genetic patterns that are now locked into the population. And when those patterns collide with the modern world, processed food, new environmental exposures, different disease pressures, the outcomes are not random. They follow patterns that a medical system built almost entirely around European genetic data has largely failed to notice or account for. Think about what this means for a Mexican patient sitting in a doctor's office today. The dosage charts, the risk calculators, the diagnostic thresholds used across much of modern medicine were built using genetic data collected overwhelmingly from populations of European descent. Those tools were never properly calibrated for a population whose ancestry runs this deep and this differently. The risk models don't reflect their specific vulnerabilities. The medications were rarely tested with their genetic background in mind. Broader estimates suggest the average genetic makeup across Mexico sits somewhere around 50 to 60% Indigenous American, roughly a third European, and a small but real African component of around 4 to 6%. But that national average hides something even more important than the number itself, because Mexico is not one uniform genetic population. It never has been. It is a patchwork of distinct genetic histories layered across geography, altitude, and centuries of separate migration patterns. Indigenous groups from different regions can be as genetically distinct from each other as Europeans are from East Asians, a reflection of ancient population divisions that have lasted for thousands of years. In the southern and southeastern parts of the country, places like Oaxaca and Chiapas, indigenous ancestry commonly reaches 70 to 90% of the genetic profile. In some of the most historically and culturally significant regions of the entire country, the population is not a blend at all in the way most people imagine. It is overwhelmingly, deeply indigenous, connected directly to ancestors who were constructing enormous ceremonial cities, while much of Europe was still forming its earliest organized societies. Meanwhile, northern and western Mexico generally show a noticeably higher share of European ancestry, sometimes reaching more than half the genetic profile in certain communities. Within the borders of a single country, you find populations as genetically different from one another as people from entirely different continents, and all of them are simply labeled Mexican. There is still another layer to this story, one that has been pushed to the margins of Mexican history for a very long time: the African contribution. Enslaved Africans were brought to Mexico during the colonial period, particularly through coastal regions such as Veracruz and Guerrero, and their descendants left a real, measurable genetic legacy. These communities, sometimes referred to as Afro-Mexican or as the third root of Mexican identity, were for most of the country's history treated as invisible. not just socially overlooked, but often left out of official records and censuses entirely. Their history rarely made it into school textbooks. Their contribution to Mexican music, food, and culture was acknowledged only slowly and only in recent decades. But their DNA never forgot them. When researchers studied coastal communities specifically, the African genetic signal showed up clearly, sometimes reaching close to 9% in certain populations along the Gulf Coast. These are not faint traces. These represent real, living communities whose ancestry connects directly back to West Africa and to one of history's greatest tragedies, the transatlantic slave trade. And their biological story is finally starting to be documented the way their historical story never fully was. All of this complexity becomes even more important once you consider how it collides with modern politics. In public conversations, especially across the border in the United States, Mexican often gets treated as one simple category, defined by language or nationality or migration status. But the genetic data tells a completely different story. The tens of millions of people of Mexican descent living outside Mexico carry one of the most genetically diverse ancestral profiles of any group on the planet, part ancient Siberian-descended indigenous lineage, part Iberian European, part West African, and connected to a dozen distinct pre-Columbian civilizations that are genetically different from one another. They do not fit neatly into a single demographic box. They never did. Every policy, every healthcare framework, every research program that treats this population as one uniform group is working from a scientifically inaccurate assumption. And that mistake has real costs. It shapes which diseases get studied, which treatments get properly tested, and who ends up misdiagnosed simply because the underlying data used to build modern medicine never fully included them. The scale of what is at stake here is enormous. Mexico is home to more than 130 million people, with tens of millions more of Mexican descent living in the United States, and additional communities scattered across Canada, Europe, and the rest of Latin America. The genetic research now being built using Mexican population data will not only benefit Mexico. It will reshape how medicine understands ancestry and disease risk across the entire Latino and Hispanic population of the Americas, providing reference information for drug development and precision medicine for a population that has been left out of major genetic databases for far too long. Underneath every statistic and every technical genetic term, there is also an extraordinary human story. It is the story of people who crossed a frozen land bridge out of Asia into an entirely empty hemisphere, who spread slowly across 2 continents over thousands of years, who built pyramids that still stand today, who developed calendar systems of remarkable precision, and who domesticated crops like corn, cacao, chili peppers, tomatoes, and avocado that now feed people all over the world. It is the story of the Olmec, the Maya, the great city of Teotihuacan, and later the Aztec, each civilization building on the foundations laid by the one before it. Genetic lineages tied to these ancient peoples did not simply vanish. They spread far beyond Mesoamerica. Certain maternal lineages connected to the builders of Teotihuacan appear among native Arctic populations, and Maya-linked maternal lineages have been found among indigenous peoples as far south as Chile and Argentina. The genetic legacy of ancient Mexican civilizations stretches from the Arctic Circle down to the southern tip of South America. In a very real biological sense, these people were not confined to one small region. They became a foundational part of an entire hemisphere's population. Then came the conquest, and everything changed almost overnight. The most devastating weapon the Spanish brought with them wasn't a sword or a cannon, it was disease. The arrival of European pathogens in the Americas triggered what may be the single largest demographic collapse in recorded human history. Populations with no prior immunity to smallpox, measles, typhus, and influenza died in numbers that are almost impossible to fully grasp. Some estimates suggest that between half and as much as 90% of the indigenous population of Mesoamerica died within just 1 century of first contact. Entire languages disappeared. Whole family lineages simply ceased to exist. Genetic diversity that had built up gradually over 15,000 years of isolated development was compressed and lost within just a handful of generations. That devastating loss is still written into the DNA of people living today, visible in patterns of shared genetic segments and stretches of the genome where both parental copies are unusually similar, evidence of a population that was catastrophically reduced and then slowly rebuilt from a much smaller surviving group. This is what a demographic catastrophe looks like when you can actually read it inside the genome, not as a metaphor, but as literal biological evidence. And the consequences of what happened 5 centuries ago haven't stopped. They continue to echo forward into modern clinics and laboratories, where a Mexican patient's genetic information is sometimes read using tools that were never designed with their unique history in mind. Yet the story isn't only about the past. One of the more surprising findings from recent research is about what is happening in the present. Newer genetic samples collected from the Mexican population show that indigenous ancestry, rather than fading away as some assumed it would with globalization, appears to be holding strong, and in some areas even becoming more prominent relative to other ancestral components. The assumption that modernization would slowly blend everything into one undifferentiated genetic average simply isn't supported by the data. An identity forged over 15,000 years of history in the Americas has proven to be remarkably resilient. It survived devastating epidemics. It survived forced cultural and religious change. It survived centuries of being pushed to the margins of the official historical narrative. And it is still there, measurable, and in many places dominant, inside a place no politics or propaganda can ever fully reach, inside the cell itself. Consider what this persistence means for modern medicine. Indigenous Mexican ancestry isn't just a label for where someone's family came from. It plays an active role in how the body interacts with diet, environment, disease, and medication. Researchers studying a critical region of the genome connected to the immune system found unusually high levels of African-derived genetic variants in that specific region among the Mexican population, representing one of the strongest examples of natural selection ever documented in humans, comparable to well-known examples like lactose tolerance evolving in northern European populations or sickle cell resistance evolving in parts of Africa. This tells us that the immune system of the Mexican population has been shaped by a set of evolutionary pressures, unlike almost any other large population on Earth. A unique combination of indigenous American, European, and African immune genetics interacting with the specific disease environments of Mesoamerica, the colonial period, and the modern world. And yet, despite carrying this remarkably unique genetic history, this population remains dramatically underrepresented in global genetic research databases. The tools used to study disease risk worldwide are still calibrated primarily around European genetic data. The reference systems that power modern precision medicine and drug development were built without fully including the genetic complexity of more than 130 million people in Mexico, plus tens of millions more across the wider diaspora. Every single day, medical decisions are made using models that were never truly built with this population in mind. Every day, findings published as universal facts about human genetics are, in a very specific and technical sense, really findings about European populations being applied more broadly than they should be. This is really the heart of the story, not just the fascinating ancient migration routes, not just the striking difference between maternal and paternal ancestry, not just the genetic echoes of vanished civilizations still living inside modern bodies. The real story is the gap, the growing distance between what science now understands about the deep genetic complexity of the Mexican people and how little of that understanding has actually made its way into global medical and research systems. That gap is not just an academic problem. It leads to real misdiagnoses. It leads to medications that behave differently and sometimes far less effectively in populations whose genetic profile was never part of the original research. The good news is that this is finally starting to change. Landmark genome studies, large-scale biobank projects, extensive surveys of maternal and paternal lineages, piece by piece, researchers are assembling what has never fully existed before: a complete, detailed genetic map of one of the most complex populations on Earth. And that map has the potential to transform modern medicine, forcing a redesign of clinical guidelines, disease risk models, and drug testing protocols. It has the power to finally make visible what has stayed hidden for 5 centuries, to give the indigenous mothers, the descendants of colonial survivors, the coastal Afro-Mexican communities, and every regional population in between a proper place in the scientific record they have always deserved but rarely received. But we are not there yet, and this is the part worth sitting with, because the question of who the Mexican people truly are, genetically and historically, isn't only being answered in research labs. It is being debated in politics, in cultural conversations, in immigration policy, in pharmaceutical research decisions, and quietly in the personal reflections of millions of individuals simply trying to understand their own roots. And most of these conversations are still happening without access to the very science that has finally, painstakingly been assembled. What happens when a population of this size finally sees its own genetic story with real clarity? What happens when the biological consequences of conquest become widely understood, not just as distant history, but as a living, ongoing reality? What happens when a medical system built around one narrow genetic template finally has to reckon with a population whose immune system, metabolism, and ancestry were shaped by an entirely different evolutionary path? Those questions don't have clear answers yet. Right now, the science has moved faster than the public understanding, faster than the policies, faster than the popular narrative. And that gap between what has been discovered and what the wider world actually knows is only slowly starting to close. The truth is this: Mexican people were never quite who the simple textbook story made them out to be. They're older, more layered, and far more biologically complex than any single tidy explanation could ever capture. And in many ways, the most important chapter of this story is still being written: how medicine responds, how identity gets reimagined, and how the long-silenced third root of Mexican ancestry finally gets the recognition it has always deserved.